The call came at 3:17 a.m. That's the first thing I remember. The digital clock on the nightstand. The way the green numbers seemed to scream in the dark. It was the hospital. My father was gone. And the last thing I had said to him was, "We'll talk tomorrow." His name was Thomas. Not Tom, Thomas. He was a man built of quiet routines and unspoken expectations. A retired engineer who believed a life, like a bridge, should be measured by its load-bearing capacity, by what it could hold without showing strain. I was his only son, David, and for most of my life I think I was a strain he never quite calculated for. We didn't fight. That would have required a kind of heat we never generated. We just existed in parallel. He in his workshop building perfect birdhouses no bird ever used. Me in my world of contracts and client dinners and a marriage that was itself a carefully constructed thing. We met for dutiful monthly lunches at a diner off the highway. We talked about the weather, the carburetor in his old truck, the market, safe, load-bearing topics. The friction was my wife, Susan, or rather my father's polite, impenetrable silence about her. He was always cordial. He remembered her birthday with a generic card, but he never asked about her work, never inquired about her family. There was a wall there made of something clearer and colder than glass. Susan felt it. "He tolerates me," she'd say, her voice tight. "For you, but he doesn't see me." I'd dismiss it. "That's just how he is. He's not a warm man." But she'd shake her head. "It's not about warmth, David. It's about acknowledgement. I'm a variable in his equation he's decided to ignore." Then 6 months before that 3 a.m. call my mother passed. A swift, brutal cancer. It hollowed my father out. The quiet routines became a ghostly pantomime. At the funeral he stood like a marble column accepting condolences with a stiff nod. Susan held his arm at one point, whispered something. He patted her hand, but his eyes were fixed on the middle distance, already somewhere else. After the will was read, a simple, everything to his son document, Susan found a sealed envelope in my mother's desk, addressed to me in her looping handwriting. Inside was a letter and a key. The letter wasn't about love or final goodbyes. It was instructions for a lockbox at a bank in the small town where I'd grown up. I drove there alone, a Tuesday afternoon. The bank was all polished granite and hushed voices. The manager, a man named Robert who remembered me as a boy, led me to a small, cold room. The lockbox didn't hold stocks or bonds or secret cash. It held a single, thick manila folder, and on top of the folder a post-it note in my mother's hand. It said, "For David, when you need to understand." Inside the folder was a case. Peterson v. Peterson, a divorce filing from 1982, 2 years before I was born. The petitioner was my father, Thomas. The respondent was a woman named Elaine. I sat in that cold room, the air smelling of dust and old paper and my world tilted on its axis. Elaine, not my mother. My mother's name was Margaret. I read the dry, legal language, irreconcilable differences. But then attached were handwritten notes, my father's precise, technical script, allegations, not of violence but of betrayal, of a trip Elaine had taken, a friendship with a man named James that had become, in my father's words, an emotional abandonment of our marriage. The case was dismissed, withdrawn, a scribbled note on the final page in a lawyer's hand, client reconciliation, marriage to be preserved. But preserved at what cost? I drove to my father's house in a daze. He was in his workshop sanding a piece of pine. The smell of sawdust, usually so comforting, felt choking. I placed the folder on his workbench. The sound it made was like a judge's gavel. He didn't look up. He just kept sanding, the rhythm never faltering. "Your mother shouldn't have kept that," he said, his voice flat. "Who is Elaine?" I asked. The question hung between us, sharp as a chisel. He put the sandpaper down. Finally, he looked at me, and in his eyes I didn't see guilt. I saw a deep, old fatigue, the fatigue of carrying a story no one was ever allowed to read. Elaine, he said, was my wife. The story came out in fragments like shards of something broken long ago. He'd been young. They'd been happy, he said, or he'd thought they were. Then he'd become suspicious. A late night, a whispered phone call, a closeness with this friend, James, that felt like a door closing in his face. He'd confronted her. She'd been evasive. In his fear and his hurt, he'd filed for divorce. He'd hired a lawyer. He'd begun building a case, not of love lost, but of wrongs committed. And then I asked, my throat tight. And then, he said, looking at his hands, she came to me. She begged me to stop. She said there was nothing with James, not in the way I thought. She said I was choosing a story over our life. She said if I went through with it, I would be divorcing the truth, not her. He withdrew the petition. They tried, for a year, but the accusation once made had become a third person in the room, a ghost named Distrust. She left, he said, the words simple and final. She met someone else, a good man, I heard. She had a family, a life. And Mom, I whispered, Margaret. I met your mother 2 years later, he said. She was kind, she was steady. She asked no questions about the past, and I offered no answers. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw a crack in the marble. I built a life with her, David, a good life. I was faithful, I provided, I loved her in my way. But I never trusted happiness again. I always checked the foundations for weakness. I always looked for the crack. The silence in the workshop was absolute. I understood everything then. The wall around Susan. It wasn't about her. It was about Elaine asterisk. It was about a ghost. He saw in Susan's independence, her career, her own mind, an echo of a woman he had wrongly accused and irrevocably lost. He was protecting himself from a story he himself had written. You punished Mom for a sin Elaine never committed, I said, the realization like ice in my veins. No, he said, his voice breaking. I punished myself, and I made you and your mother live in the prison I built. That was our last real conversation. The lunches after that were suffocating. We both knew the truth sat between us, a monstrous, uninvited guest. We talked about the carburetor with a new, desperate focus. Then the 3 a.m. call, the massive coronary, the swift, silent exit. At his house after the funeral, sorting through his things, I found it. In the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath old tax returns, a small hinged box. Inside, not a photo of my mother, but a single black and white picture of a young woman laughing, her head thrown back. On the back, in his writing, Elaine, Mackinac Island, 1979. He had carried her, not as a love, but as a verdict he had passed on himself, guilty of destroying his own happiness. And in doing so, he had engineered a life where joy was always a suspect variable, where love had to be proven, not given, where his son learned that intimacy was a risk that could lead to a courtroom of the heart. I am now the age he was when I was born. I live in the house he left me. I look at Susan sometimes across the dinner table, and I feel a cold fear. I hear his voice in my head when she works late. I see his suspicion in my own mind when she's quiet, lost in thoughts she doesn't share. I am auditing our marriage for cracks he taught me to expect. The mistake he made wasn't falling out of love. It was believing that the story of a betrayal, a story he authored from his own fear, was more real than the woman standing in front of him. He chose the narrative over the person. And then he spent a lifetime making that narrative true for everyone around him. He built a faultless, sturdy, empty bridge. And he taught me how to be its lonely caretaker. The key from my mother's letter sits on my dresser. I look at it every morning. It doesn't open the lockbox anymore. That's done. It's supposed to open something else, I think. Something my mother knew I would need. But here is the truth I am staring at, in this quiet house, with the woman I love sleeping down the hall. I am afraid I have inherited the lock. And I have no idea how to find the door. If you find this story interesting, kindly like and subscribe to my channel for more interesting stories.